House of Israel International Services are held weekly at 3601 Rose Lake Drive, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28217, 11 a.m. Saturday mornings and 7 p.m. Thursday evenings, Eastern Time. This live broadcast is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Your financial support is greatly appreciated. Thank you. Motivating. Inspiring. Challenging. Encouraging. Deepening. Strengthening. And enhancing your faith. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to House of Israel International's live worship service.
We are looking at James. Now, I'll tell you right now, we're only going to get through one verse, and that is verse 1. I'll just tell you that right off the bat. But there is so much here, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, when we start a new teaching, that we want to make sure that we cover the introduction. And you know, we've taught over and over that whenever you look at a writing, you want to find out its author, you want to find out who it's written to, you want to find out why it was written, and you want to find out when it was written. You know that a person can't write something if they're dead, right? And if you look at a writing and this writing happened long after a person died, you have to come to the conclusion that this writing wasn't from this person, even though they may have tried to put the name on it. You also know you can't write if you haven't been born, right? And so if a writing came before a person was born, and this is why it's so important for us to do the geography and the genealogy on certain particular issues, because when we look at a lot of the material that we're looking for to verify a particular writing, then the material is there. You just have to know where to look for it. And so we're going to look at James today. And James starts out simply saying James. Now, James lets us know right off the bat, or the letter of James let us know that even though the letter is named James, that it was written by James. And just because, we know that 1st, 2nd Corinthians and Timothy, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy has Timothy's name on them. But Timothy didn't write them, right? And so James here says this, I wrote this. Now we just have to find out what James wrote it, because the New Testament lets us know that there are several James that are in the mix, and so we have to narrow that down. James, a servant of Elohim. So we know this James was a servant of Elohim. We also know, and of the Lord, Yeshua, Messiah. So he's a servant of Elohim. He has faith in the Almighty, his commands, which he's going to address. In the very first chapter, he has faith in Yehovah, and he keeps the commands, and he has faith. So he identifies as a servant of Elohim and of Yeshua, Messiah. Now, how many of you know that there are people who are followers of Yeshua, but they don't have faith in Yehovah? They say they do. But, John comes along clearly and says that if you say you love God and you don't keep his commandments, you are a what? A liar. And there's a lot of lying folks out there claiming to be saints. And it's not like they're making up lies about certain things outside the book. They're making up lies about stuff that's in the book. And so it says James, he's a servant of Elohim and of Yeshua. And he's writing, it says clearly, to who? The 12 tribes. Where are they? Scattered, and they're scattered abroad. So we're gonna see this. And then he says greetings. So in the very first chapter, we see that James here is dealing with the 12 tribes. Now, how many of you know He's not writing to Christians. Now, unless they were Hebrew Christians, if there was such a thing, but there was no such a thing in the day that James wrote this. So he specifically writes, and see, but because of these kinds of things, James' letter is problematic. His letter is controversial and extremely important for believers today. Because, see, James cuts to the chase on a lot of issues. The letter of James, according to some, shouldn't be in the Bible. And one particular individual that was problem with James' writing was a fellow named Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther is one of those individuals who probably had the greatest impact from a doctrinal writing perspective besides this other guy named Marcion, who just introduced a lot of stuff in there that is still going strong. People who are Marcionians have never heard of Marcion. And yet they follow Marcionian teaching. And a clear Marcionian teaching is that the Old Testament is no longer valid. It's history. And so people who claim to be New Testament believers who are not under the Old Testament law clearly are under Marcionian teaching, because even Martin Luther didn't really teach that. And so, but Martin Luther had a problem with James. Why? Because Martin Luther taught faith. He taught faith alone. His premier verse of the Bible is found in Paul's writings in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Yeshua Messiah, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first, and then to the Greek. You see. And then where Paul writes in James, Romans chapter 10, where he talked about we are, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. That when Paul wrote, we are saved by grace, or saved by faith through grace, or saved by grace through faith. These were premier teachings of Martin Luther, who came away and began to introduce what is now known today as a doctrine of grace. That all we need, brother, is grace. We're saved by grace, grace alone. But that wasn't really Martin Luther, that was more Marcionian. Martin Luther was faith alone. And so Martin Luther, in his faith alone doctrine, had a real problem with James, because James says, listen, faith without works is dead. And so they wanted to put James in the Jewish category. And this is what has happened in Christianity, is you have to separate the Jews from the Gentiles, because this, the Old Testament was for the Jews, and the New Testament, which is really the new covenant, which is the birth of the church, is for the Gentiles. So that separation between the Old Testament and Old Covenant, as it is relegated to, and the New Testament taking on the nature of the New Covenant, Jew, Gentile. And so Marcion, and then even though Martin Luther rejected Marcionian teaching along with the Catholic Church, it took hold, and it continues to this day. Now, you may be surprised, but there are a lot of things that took hold that continue to this day that people can't explain. And a major one is Sunday worship. People just go to church on Sunday. They can't explain why. They cannot find a biblical mandate. But it is steeped in church tradition. Christmas, steeped in church tradition. Can't even find it in the Bible. And so to have things that are so prevalent in traditional practice that cannot be supported, or they do find scripture to support it, but is not even mentioned. Christmas is not mentioned in the Bible, and Sunday worship as the day of the Lord, other than perverting particular scriptures, cannot be found. James' letter gives us insight into first century faith among the believers, and is a very encouraging and Torah-centered document. And as we go through James, you're going to see the Torah throughout James's letter. In this teaching, we will learn more about who James was, the authority James had in the first century and beyond, and why James wrote this letter, to whom the letter was written to, and how his writing shaped the first century believers' doctrinal position on the teachings of Yeshua. In the introduction, the writer introduces himself as James. The first verse lets us know exactly who this letter was written to. And who was it written to? The 12 tribes who were scattered abroad. Now, who was James? Well, James was the brother of Yeshua, the James who wrote this letter. And he had a brother named Jude, and the brother of Jude, because Jude wrote the book of Jude, or the letter that is subscribed to Jude is also James' brother. And James was the authority figure in Acts chapter 15. Now, James had 3 other brothers, plus or beside Yeshua. James had sisters, but the Bible doesn't tell us their names. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, in addressing this Yeshua, says, in his hometown, the people asked, is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren, Simon or James, and Josie, and Simon, and Judas. And so we see that James had 3 other brothers besides Yeshua. And in verse 56, and his sisters, plural. So we know he had sisters. Are they not all with us? Whence then has this man all these things? And so it was obvious to those in his hometown that Yeshua set apart, was really set apart from his brothers and his sisters. Because what Yeshua's conversation was, and his brothers and sisters' conversations, was very different. And so he was set apart from his brother James, Josie, Simon, and Judas. Our first introduction to James is found in the Gospel of Matthew, which we just read, where he is identified as the brother of Yeshua. Yeshua had 2 disciples named James, the Apostle James, the brother of John, the sons of Zebedee, and the Apostle James, the son of Alphaeus, and they are found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 10, verses 2 and 3. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: the first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James, the sons of Zebedee, and John, his brother. So we see James and John. And then there's Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican. And then there's this other James, the son of Alphaeus, or Alphaeus as some would say, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus. So we see that Yeshua had 2 disciples named James who became apostles. But neither one of these was his brother James, who wrote the book of James, or the letter of James. So already we see there are 3 James we're going to read about in the Bible. And if you did not know or research or studied or went deep, you wouldn't know which James was being talked about at any given moment. It was James who settled the matter and issued the first proclamations to the Gentile believers in Acts 15, the First Jerusalem Council. Now, that was one of the first DVDs we put out professionally it was called Acts 15, the First Jerusalem Council. What do we do with the Gentiles? And that's in the bookstore. And after they had held, Acts 15, verse 13, and the question, remember, is that some brothers came down and they were teaching that in order for you to be a believer in Yeshua, you had to first be circumcised. And they got to understand, you had to first be circumcised and keep the law, or be circumcised according to Moses and keep the law. Now, who was teaching this? Because it was very clear in Acts chapter 15 that these individuals was of Pharisee persuasion. They were followers of Yeshua, but they were also Pharisees. Now you have to understand, you could be a follower of Yeshua and be Baptist. You could be a follower of Yeshua and be Pentecostal. And what I've experienced, and this is why, when you try to bring together people from different backgrounds, mostly, even though there's not a whole lot of us in this room, most of you all came from different backgrounds. And when people come from different backgrounds into the Hebrew roots or the Messianic, guess what they bring with them? They backgrounds. They may not no longer associate or identify as Baptists. They may say they're Messianic, but they got Baptist beliefs or tendencies, because the minute you start speaking in tongues, that Baptist is going to rise up. Right? He's going to rise up. Why? Because it's there. If you're Pentecostal persuasion, and somebody stands up and begin to damn tongues, or speak evil of prophecy, that Pentecostal in you going to rise up. Right? So what you come in with is what you bring. And here are some individuals who were Pharisees who took on faith in Yeshua, but they still had Pharisees' persuasion. Their teachings were still Pharisaic. And, I studied some of Paul, and, when Paul talks about counting, the things he taught as dung, there's still some things that Paul seems to weave in his teachings that suggest that Phariseeism hasn't been completely washed away. Now, we're not going to get into Paul. We'll stay with James. But I've said that before, and I've kind of pointed some things out. But the bottom line is that these individuals in Acts chapter 15 were of the Pharisee. Matter of fact, let's just take a quick moment and look at verse number chapter 15. Just so you'll know, I jumped ahead there. And in verse number 5 says, "But there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed." You see that? Now, why is the writer got to let us know certain of the sect of the Pharisees who were believers? Because they're about to bring in some Pharisee belief in the midst of a messianic congregation. You see this? Members of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. Now, some would argue that based on that statement and Paul's response and the elders and the apostles, that the statement alone suggests that you no longer have to be circumcised or keep the commands. But what the writer tells us is that their understanding of the circumcision and the commandments were based on a Pharisee teaching. It wasn't that they were teaching the circumcision according to Moses and keeping the commandments according to Moses, but they were teaching circumcision according to the Pharisees and keeping the commandments according to the Pharisees, which Paul used to be. And Paul says, wait a minute, that's Pharisaic doctrine. I count that stuff dung. You're mixing, brothers. That's what's going on here. There's some mixing. And you see a lot of mixture in messianic congregations. Too much mixing. And pretty soon you can't distinguish the truth from the traditions. And, I know this gets me in trouble, but hey, if you're called to bring forth truth, you got to stand on that and trust the Almighty. And, I'm thankful that even though I stand here and boldly declare this, those brothers, some of them, they know I'm right, and they still invite me in, come in and teach and preach. I don't know if they want me to come in so they can try to influence me, or I think it's more the other way around. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. In Acts 13, James, it says, and after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, men, brethren, listen to me. Simon or Simeon has declared how Elohim at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And to this agree the words of the prophets, as it is written. After this I will return and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down. And I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up. Now, this is James. He's talking. Now, the way the church, at least the churches that I've been in, decipher this passage, rebuilding the tabernacle of David, is Messianics, many have interpreted this to mean worship in Davidic dance. Churches have determined this to be a Davidic order of worship as such, which was done during the time of David, and therefore I will dance like David danced. So the tabernacle of David rebuilding is really an issue of worship when it has absolutely nothing to do with any of that. The fact is that prophetically, the scepter would never leave the house of David. But after the first temple was destroyed, you had the house of Israel and you had the house of Judah. Now understand something. It doesn't mean that the scepter would not leave Judah, because just because David was of the line of Judah doesn't mean that the king would come from the line of Judah. Because if it came from the line of Judah, as some have declared the Lion of Judah, that's not the issue. Because there were many Judites. There were many of the house of Judah. But there was only one house within the lineage of Judah that the scepter would stay in, and the Lion of Judah, which should be the Lion of the house of David. Not the Lion of Judah, because what it does is that it establishes Judah as the holy house of God, when there's only one house within the line of Judah that the scepter and the king and the Mashiach would come through, and that's the house of David, not the house of Judah, but the house of David, which is in the house of Judah. So you got people who've elevated Judah. But this tabernacle refers to a tent. It refers to a house. It refers to the promise of Jehovah, who said to David, the king, you will always have an heir on the throne of Israel. When Yeshua came, the households who were ruling Israel as kings was Herod. Herod Antipas, Herod the Great, Herod the Tetrarch, neither of them was from the house of David. And so James is saying, listen, Israel has a king, but it's from the wrong house. But the Almighty, in keeping his word, is saying that the house of David will have an heir. And Yeshua is of the house of David. It's falling down right now. Why? Because there's no heir from David's house sitting on the throne. You got kings who have hijacked the kingdom. You got people who have hijacked the land. You got folks who have hijacked the name. So there's a whole lot of hijacking, and because people are lazy, listening to teachers who have been taught by teachers, who have been taught about by other teachers, who are simply perpetuating and regurgitating the stuff that have been taught with their own revelations in betweenst. And now you got all this confusion. When if we just go back to the simplicity, James says, listen, I am going to build again the tabernacle or the house of David, which is fallen down. And I will build again the ruins thereof, and I will set it up. So what is he going to set up? He's going to set up his kingdom. And in his kingdom, the one who rules on the throne will be a descendant of David, who will be part of the house of Judah. Not just anybody in the house of Judah. Because if you didn't pay attention to what he said, somebody who claimed to be a Jew can become a king even though they have no relationship with David. That the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, said the Lord, who doeth all these things. Known unto Elohim are all his works from the beginning of the world. Wherefore, my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to Elohim. This is James still talking. But that we write unto them. So this is James' suggestion that they abstain from pollutions of idols and from fornication and from things strangled and from blood. Now, quick question. Did James just do away with the Torah in this passage? No. Because there's so many who wants to argue that all the Gentiles have to do, brother, is abstain from idols, fornication, strangled things, and blood. So you can still commit adultery. So you can still have relationships with animals. So you can eat pork. You can eat, abominable things. You can violate your neighbor's animals and property. No, James makes a suggestion saying, hey, the Gentiles, they're not familiar with our commands, so let's not make it difficult for them to come in by putting all of these. And that's what people want to claim that we're trying to do. Just because I teach in circumcision don't require anybody to be circumcised to be a part of the ministry. Now, you go to some places and you can't come in and worship without a kippah. Here, you got to wear this. Well, why do I need to wear this? Well, if you want to worship here, you got to wear this. Well, why do I need to wear this? Because it's our tradition. So you're going to force me to keep a tradition to worship with you. And people go to Israel and they want to go to the wall. So, no, you got to put this on to go to the wall. Why I got to go and stand at a wall and pray with that on my head? Well, if that's required, I don't need to go to that wall and pray. It's not like Jehovah is housed in between the bricks. But for some people, that's a hallowed ground. No, you holy. No, I got to go to Israel to pray. Really? Who told you that? And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to knock, but people got in their heads all of these religious things that have come from religion, and now that they're at that rock swaying, davening, they are really now in tune with the Almighty. And I see this, and it breaks my heart, and I know it breaks the Almighty's heart. You see, trust me, if Jehovah was at that rock, at that wall, there'd be a temple still there. But understand something, even when the temple was there was no ark of his covenant or presence there. Because when Herod's temple was built, when Zerubbabel's temple was built, there was no ark. Big rock. But people are so enamored by the customs and the traditions of the past to where it almost like urinate on what Yeshua has actually done. And that's sad. You see people giving more reverence to the scroll than the one who gave the writings in the scroll. People are more concerned about touching the Torah than touching the hem of his garment. And you call me irreverent, whatever you want to call, but I'm telling the truth. I don't need to touch a scroll to connect with him. I don't need to go to a wall to connect with him. Wherever you are, whoever calls upon the name of the Almighty will be delivered, will be saved. It says, for Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. So James is saying, listen, let's not burden the Gentiles. Let them come in, because they're going to hear the reading. If they come into the faith, they're going to hear the readings, and they'll be instructed further. Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole congregation to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas surnamed Barsabbas and Silas, chief men among the brethren. Now, James nor his brother believed Yeshua was the Savior while he was alive. John chapter 7, verse 2. Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. Really should be the Feast of Tabernacle. His brethren therefore said unto him, depart hence and go into Judea, that they, thy disciples also, may see the works that thou doest. For there is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world, for neither did his brethren believe in him. You see this? Neither did his brethren believe in him. Who? Simon, Judas, Josie, and James. It wasn't until Yeshua revealed, or after Yeshua revealed himself to James, after his resurrection, did James become a believer, a follower, and teacher in Yeshua's name. 1 Corinthians 15:1, Paul wrote, now, brothers, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Messiah died for our sins according to the scriptures, and he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of his brethren, of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James. Then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. Who wrote the letter? James, to whom the 12 tribes scattered abroad. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Yeshua Messiah, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. Now, in Acts chapter 1, Acts chapter 8, verse 1, we see what this scattered abroad is. Because here in Acts chapter 8, they're scattered. James is part of this, but he stays, and he's now part of the council in Acts 15, 5 chapters later. Or, in this case, 7. And Saul was consenting unto his death, and at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all what? Scattered abroad. Now, where is abroad? Throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So they were at Jerusalem, but now they're in Samaria, and they're in other parts of Judea. Okay? When was the letter written? Some date the letter in the early 60s, AD 60. Others indicate it was written before AD 50. So that's a big stretch between AD 50 or before and AD 60s. James was executed later. Why did he write? He wrote for encouragement, for strength, and instructions in maintaining faith through sufferings, trials, and tribulations. James addresses the issues of struggles, of suffering, of trials, of tribulation, persecution. And he instructs in his letters because he wanted to encourage the people. Now, we're going to look at some of the major messianic doctrines, and then we're going to close. Because you're going to find these particular doctrines in the writings of James. James addressed trials and temptations. He addressed our faith being tested. He deals with being a doer of the word, not just a hearer. He deals with favoritism. He addresses the issue of faith and works. And we're going to see these things as we go through his letter. He deals with the tongue. James addresses the wisdom that comes from above and the wisdom of the world. He addresses worldliness. James talks about how there should be no distinction in how you deal with the wealthy and the poor. James addresses other doctrines or teachings. He handles oppression and sickness. And he deals very strongly with the power of prayer. And so James addresses all of these particular doctrines in his letter, and he is going to show us how we too, as followers in Messiah, dealing with the persecutions, the trials, the tribulations, the various types of sufferings that we go through. And I know that there are people out there now who are suffering on a variety of different levels. You know, it seems like every day for the past couple of weeks, I've had to deal with encouraging people who are dealing with loss, the loss of loved ones, the loss of a spouse, the loss of, dealing with separation in relationships, loss of job. And one thing you're going to find that James is going to show us is that there is, how do you deal with when you have family members who have turned on you because of your faith? And see, again, I love reading James because whenever I'm troubled about something specific or, I appreciate so much. The reason why I appreciate Peter and James and John and Matthew in their writings, and I know they're focused. The Gospels are focused on Yeshua, but how many of you know that you can hear a teaching and not know how to apply it? I mean, you can hear it. you can study, and this is why you got so many different interpretations. But see, the beauty of the disciples who followed Yeshua, the Messiah that was promised in the Torah, is that they watched how Yeshua lived it. You understand? He didn't just teach it. He wasn't like a lot of the Pharisees who had their public life and then their behind the scenes life, right? See, the Pharisees and Sadducees disciples didn't go home with him. They went to class, right? Yeshua's disciples, wherever Yeshua laid his head, the disciples' heads weren't too far away. Where Yeshua went to pray, the disciples weren't too far away. Whatever Yeshua did, wherever he taught, wherever he went, they were right there as eyewitnesses to the works that Yeshua. They watched how he taught, they watched how he lived, they saw how his walk and his talk aligned themselves, and therefore they now had this perfect living example. So when they teach and when they write, they're writing as an eyewitness, not as somebody who studied all these writings and come together with a commentary on the interpretation of these writings, who had no witness whatsoever. Are you seeing this? I would much rather talk to a person who walked with Yeshua than somebody who wrote about him from different sources. What about you? So that's why the book of Acts and Romans and James and Peter and, that's why these writings are so important to me. Are they more important than Torah? Oh, no. There's no books in the Bible that is more important than the others. It's that we learn certain things from certain ones, and therefore the one who I will always be going to is the one who we must Shema. He's the one. And last time I checked, his name was not Rabbi Jesus. You hear me? It was Yeshua. Father, we thank you so much for our time together, and we pray that you teach us and show us how to glean from the writings of James and how we are to take his writings and to apply them in our lives today. We just honor you and reverence you and bless you in Messiah. Amen. Shalom, saints. Tithing and giving first fruit offerings are critical parts of the believer's faith and has its foundation back in Genesis 4:4, when Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And Jehovah had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Abel was commended by Jehovah in Hebrews 11:4, where it states that by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Solomon said in Proverbs 3:9-10, honor Jehovah with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall your barns be filled with plenty, and your presses shall burst out with new wine. The prophet Malachi wrote in chapter 3, verse 11 and 12, to bring ye all the tithe into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, says Jehovah of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing, that there should not be room enough to receive it. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the field, says Jehovah of hosts. And all nations shall call you blessed, for you shall be a delightsome land, saith Jehovah of hosts. When we tithe and give offerings consistently in obedience to Jehovah's commandments, we can count on him to keep his promises to us and consistently meet all of our needs. It is our Father's desire to bless you. However, it begins with you and your act of obedience to tithe and give offerings. Do it today. Shalom.
For more information, visit www.arthurbaileyministries.com or call 888-899-1479. House of Israel International Services is made possible through financial contributions from brothers and sisters like you. Thank you.